Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases of mass murder in American library history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will move you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that transformed the sanctuary of knowledge into a chamber of death, where a trusted keeper of books defied all expectations of her profession and left a legacy so poisonous that libraries across the nation changed their protocols forever. It was the year 1941. The world was ablaze with war. Europe had been consumed by conflict for 2 years. And though America had not yet entered the fray, the shadow of global violence loomed over every community. In the small town of Crestwood, Pennsylvania, nestled in the Appalachian foothills between Pittsburgh and the Maryland border, the situation was deceptively peaceful. A coal mining town of approximately 3,000 souls, Crestwood represented the quintessential American community. Church socials on Sundays, Friday night football games, and at the heart of civic life, the Carnegie-funded public library that had served the community since 1898. The Crestwood Public Library stood on Main Street like a fortress of red brick and limestone, its arched windows gazing onto the town square where miners gathered after their shifts, where housewives exchanged gossip, where children played beneath the bronze statue of some forgotten Civil War colonel. Inside those walls, between shelves of aging books and beneath gas lamps that had been converted to electric only a decade prior, the air always smelled of leather bindings, floor wax, and the particular mustiness that accumulates where knowledge is stored. And there, behind the circulation desk, day after day for 23 years, sat Miss Helena Grayson, 47 years old, unmarried, unfailingly polite. A woman who knew every patron by name, who could recommend the perfect novel for a restless teenager or locate an obscure reference text for the town doctor. She wore her graying hair in a tight bun, dressed in modest dark skirts and high-collared blouses, and spoke in the hushed tones appropriate to her profession. Children adored her because she never shushed them too harshly. Adults respected her because she maintained order without condescension. Nobody suspected that in the basement of her ancestral home on Willow Street, Miss Grayson had been cultivating something far deadlier than late fees. To understand how poison found its way into the pages of Crestwood's most beloved institution, you must first understand the town itself and the peculiar isolation that mountains create. Crestwood was not a place people passed through. You were born there, or you came to work the mines, or you didn't come at all. The town occupied a valley between two ridges of the Appalachian chain, accessible by a single lane road that wound through forest so thick that even in summer, the canopy created a perpetual twilight. The coal company had built Crestwood in the 1870s, and the town had grown around the mine the way a tree grows around a nail, incorporating the wound into its very structure. By 1941, the mine was in decline. The richest veins had been exhausted. Men who once descended into darkness with the certainty of employment now found shifts shortened, wages reduced. The Depression had struck Crestwood particularly hard, and recovery had been slow, incomplete, uncertain. The library, ironically, had become more vital than ever. When a man cannot afford the cinema, he borrows books. When a woman wants to escape the cramped company, housing, and screaming children, she sits in the reading room with a magazine. When teenagers seek privacy from watchful parents, they study together at the long oak tables beneath the stern gaze of Andrew Carnegie's portrait. The library was sanctuary, refuge, neutral ground, and Helena Grayson was its guardian angel. She had been hired in 1918, just months after the Great War ended, when her predecessor, Mrs. Blackwood, died of the Spanish flu that swept through the valley like a scythe through wheat. Helena was 20, 4 then, freshly educated at a women's college in Philadelphia, filled with progressive ideas about library science and community literacy. She returned to her hometown, the place she'd been so eager to escape, because her aging parents needed her, because the position offered security, because sometimes duty trumps desire. Her parents died within 3 years of each other. Pneumonia took her father in 1920. Cancer claimed her mother in 1922. Helena inherited the house on Willow Street, a tall, narrow Victorian with peeling paint and a garden that had gone wild with neglect. She lived there alone, walking the 8 blocks to the library each morning at precisely 7:30, rain or shine, winter or summer, returning home each evening at precisely 6:15. For 23 years, this routine never varied. Neighbors found her pleasant but distant. She attended the Methodist church, but sat in the back pew and left immediately after service. She belonged to no clubs, hosted no dinners, received no gentlemen callers despite being considered handsome in her youth. The librarian was simply part of the town's furniture, reliable, unremarkable, essentially invisible, which is precisely what made her so dangerous. The library itself was a Carnegie Grant building, one of nearly 3,000 funded by the steel magnate's philanthropy in the early 20th century. 3 stories of red brick with a slate roof, it featured a grand reading room on the main floor with 20-foot ceilings, tall windows that let in natural light, and row upon row of oak bookshelves. The second floor housed the reference collection and the librarian's office. The basement contained storage, the furnace room, and archives of local newspapers dating back to the town's founding. Approximately 200 patrons visited the library each week. The busiest times were Saturday mornings, when mothers brought children for story hour, and weekday evenings, when working men stopped by to read newspapers they couldn't afford to purchase. The reading room never had fewer than a dozen people between the hours of 2 and 6 in the afternoon. These people miners, housewives, merchants, children trusted the library implicitly. They trusted the books. They trusted Miss Grayson. That trust would prove fatal. The first death occurred on March 7, 1941, though nobody recognized it as murder at the time. Robert Henshaw, age 34, a coal miner and father of 3, collapsed in his kitchen on a Thursday evening. He'd been reading at the library that afternoon, a Zane Grey Western he'd checked out 2 days prior. That evening he complained of nausea, then violent stomach cramps. By midnight he was vomiting blood. The doctor arrived too late. Henshaw died in agony at 2:17 in the morning. The doctor ruled it acute gastritis, possibly food poisoning. The widow wept. The company provided a modest death benefit. The town mourned a good man gone too soon, and life continued. 3 weeks later, on March 29th, Dorothy Caldwell died. 50, 2 years old, a seamstress, unmarried. She was known for spending entire afternoons in the library reading room, devouring romance novels and fashion magazines. She died the same way Henshaw had violent illness, bloody vomiting, convulsions. The doctor was puzzled, but attributed it to perhaps a bad batch of preserved food, though Mrs. Caldwell's sister insisted Dorothy had eaten nothing unusual. Then on April 10th, 16, old Thomas Fletcher became violently ill after studying at the library. He survived, but barely, 3 days of agonizing sickness that left him 20 pounds lighter and weak as a newborn. His mother sat vigil beside his bed, praying, bargaining with God. The boy lived, but the pattern had been established. 3 incidents in 5 weeks, all involving library patrons, all presenting the same symptoms: severe gastrointestinal distress, bloody vomiting, convulsions, either death or prolonged critical illness. The town doctor, Emmett Morrison, was a competent physician who'd practiced in Crestwood for 30 years. He'd seen influenza epidemics, mining accidents, childhood diseases, but this was different. The symptoms resembled poisoning. On April 14th, Dr. Morrison did something unprecedented. He contacted the state police. The Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in Somerset County received the call on a Tuesday afternoon. Morrison explained his concerns carefully, methodically. 3 cases with identical presentation. 2 deaths, 1 near death. All victims were library patrons. Could it be environmental, water contamination, gas leak? The state police sent Detective Sergeant William Ashford, a man of 43, with 15 years of experience investigating everything from bootlegging to murder. He arrived in Crestwood on April 16th, a Wednesday morning when mist still clung to the valley and the coal mine whistle hadn't yet signaled the shift change. Ashford was thorough, meticulous, patient. He began by interviewing Dr. Morrison, reviewing the medical records of all 3 victims. The symptoms were consistent. Onset between 6 and 12 hours after exposure, beginning with nausea and progressing rapidly to violent vomiting, bloody diarrhea, convulsions, and in the fatal cases, apparent organ failure. Morrison had preserved tissue samples from both deceased victims against standard practice because something about the deaths troubled him deeply. "What kind of poison presents this way?" Ashford asked. Morrison pulled out a medical textbook, flipped to a marked page. Heavy metal poisoning, arsenic specifically, but arsenic takes days, even weeks, to kill. This was hours, fast-acting, extremely toxic, but with the characteristic gastrointestinal symptoms of arsenic. Where would someone obtain arsenic in quantity? That's the problem, Sergeant. Anywhere. Rat poison, weed killer, taxidermy supplies, mining operations use it. It's ubiquitous. Ashford spent the next 3 days interviewing victims' families, retracing their final movements, searching for the common link beyond the library. What had they eaten, drunk, touched? The answer was frustratingly simple, nothing unusual. Henshaw ate what his family ate. They suffered no ill effects. Caldwell prepared her own meals from ingredients her sister also consumed. Young Fletcher ate his mother's cooking, which sustained 6 other family members without incident. The library connection seemed circumstantial. Hundreds of people used the library. Why only 3 victims? On April 19th, Ashford visited the library for the first time. The building seemed unremarkable, clean, well maintained, quiet. He arrived at 11 in the morning when perhaps 20 patrons occupied the reading room, some at tables, others browsing shelves. Miss Grayson sat at the circulation desk, stamping due dates in returned books with mechanical precision. Ashford introduced himself quietly, showing his credentials. Helena Grayson's face remained perfectly composed, though her hands paused briefly in their work. "How may I assist you, Sergeant?" Her voice was soft, cultured, with the faintest trace of the local accent she'd nearly eradicated through years of self-conscious refinement. "I'm investigating some deaths in town. I understand all the victims were library patrons." "Oh, yes, dreadful. Poor Mr. Henshaw and Mrs. Caldwell. I attended both funerals, and young Thomas Fletcher. I was so relieved to hear he recovered." "Can you tell me what they checked out, what they were reading?" Helena consulted her circulation records, handwritten in beautiful copperplate script. Mr. Henshaw borrowed The Mysterious Rider by Zane Grey on March 5th. Mrs. Caldwell had the robe by Lloyd Douglas and 2 issues of Ladies' Home Journal. Thomas had several textbooks for his schoolwork, mathematics, American history. Did they handle any of the same books? I couldn't say for certain. Many patrons browse before selecting. They touched dozens of books. Ashford examined the reading room. The long oak tables were immaculate. The books on shelves stood in perfect order. Everything smelled of polish and care. Has anything unusual happened here recently? Any complaints? Any damage to books or furnishings? Nothing whatsoever, Sergeant. The library operates quite normally. She was helpful, cooperative, seemingly transparent. Ashford had no reason to suspect her, but something nagged at him. Some instinct developed over years of interviewing witnesses and suspects. Helena Grayson was too composed, too calm. Most people, when confronted by police investigating deaths, showed nervousness, anxiety, eagerness to help. The librarian showed only mild interest, as if discussing overdue books rather than murder. Ashford requested permission to inspect the building. Helena agreed immediately, leading him through the stacks, the reference room, her small office on the second floor. Everything was orderly, professional. The basement was accessed through a door behind the circulation desk. She produced a key from the chain at her waist. We keep it locked. The furnace room and archives are down there. Nothing of interest to most patrons. The basement was colder, damper. Brick walls sweated moisture. The furnace stood silent in one corner, unnecessary in April. Metal shelving held boxes of old newspapers, decades of the Crestwood Herald stacked and slowly deteriorating. Ashford saw nothing suspicious. Do you spend much time down here? Only when filing archives or checking the furnace in winter. They returned upstairs. Ashford thanked her, said he might have more questions. Helena Grayson smiled politely and returned to her desk. The detective stood on the library steps, breathing cold mountain air, reviewing what he knew. 3 victims. Library connection, no obvious poison source, no clear motive. If this was murder, and he increasingly believed it was, the perpetrator was sophisticated, careful, patient. And somewhere in this small town, they were preparing to kill again. On April 23rd, Ashford received the toxicology results from the state laboratory in Harrisburg. The preserved tissue samples from Henshaw and Caldwell showed massive quantities of arsenic trioxide, enough to kill a horse. The concentration suggested ingestion of nearly pure poison, not accidental exposure to contaminated food or water. This was deliberate, calculated, murder, but how? How had the killer delivered poison to victims with no apparent connection except reading? The answer came from an unexpected source: Thomas Fletcher, the boy who survived. Ashford interviewed him on April 24th in the Fletcher home, a cramped miner's cottage that smelled of cabbage and coal smoke. Thomas sat propped in bed, still weak but recovering. His mother hovered nervously while Ashford asked questions. "Thomas, do you remember what you were doing before you got sick?" "Studying. I had a history test." "At the library?" "Yes, sir. I was there for about 2 hours." "What did you do besides study? Did you eat anything, drink anything?" "No, sir. Just studied, and I was licking my fingers." "Licking your fingers?" "To turn pages. The textbook was old. The pages stuck together. I kept wetting my fingers to separate them." Ashford felt electricity run through him. "Did you check out this textbook, or was it from the library's collection?" "From the library. Miss Grayson found it for me in the reference section." "Is that textbook still in your possession?" Thomas gestured weakly to his school bag hanging on a chair. Ashford crossed the room, extracted the book carefully. A History of the American Republic, published in 1933. A thick volume, bound in fading blue cloth. Ashford opened it carefully, not touching the pages directly. He could see nothing unusual, but he wrapped the book in newspaper anyway, handling it like the weapon it might be. "Mrs. Fletcher, do you have a clean cloth, and gloves?" She brought dish towels and her husband's work gloves. Ashford wrapped the book again, tightly. "I'm taking this with me. Don't touch any other books from the library. In fact, don't go to the library at all until I say otherwise." The State Laboratory in Harrisburg received the textbook on April 25th. The forensic chemist, Dr. Arnold Weber, examined it with the thoroughness that would revolutionize forensic science in coming decades. He found arsenic on 83 of the book's 417 pages, not on all pages. The distribution was calculated, deliberate. Pages in the middle section, the chapters Thomas would have studied for his test, were heavily contaminated. The poison had been mixed with something sticky, perhaps glycerin or petroleum jelly, and painted onto the pages in a thin, nearly invisible layer. A reader touching those pages, then unconsciously touching their mouth, licking their fingers, or even rubbing their eyes, would ingest the poison. The more you read, the more poison you absorbed. Dr. Weber called Ashford directly. "Sergeant, this is diabolical. Whoever did this understood human behavior. Students lick their fingers to turn pages. Readers touch their faces constantly. The delivery mechanism is brilliant and horrifying. How much arsenic are we talking about?" "Enough to kill 30 people if ingested in sufficient quantities. And I suspect this isn't the only poisoned book." Ashford felt his stomach tighten. "How do we find the others?" "Test every book those victims touched, and pray to God nobody else has been reading in the meantime." On April 26th, Ashford returned to the library with 4 state police officers, Dr. Weber, and a warrant to search the premises and seize evidence. Helena Grayson sat at her desk, serene as always, when 6 men entered with the authority of law. Patrons looked up from their reading, startled. The quiet sanctuary erupted into whispered confusion. "Miss Grayson, I need you to close the library immediately and ask all patrons to leave." Ashford said firmly, "On what grounds?" "Murder investigation. These officers will escort everyone out. Nobody touches any books on their way." For the first time, Helena's composure cracked. Her face paled. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the desk bell. She rang to signal closing time. The library emptied in minutes. Ashford positioned an officer at the door. Dr. Weber donned gloves and began systematic examination of books from the circulation records. He found poison in 7 books: The Mysterious Rider, the Zane Grey Western that killed Robert Henshaw; arsenic on 42 pages; The Robe, the Lloyd Douglas novel Dorothy Caldwell had been reading; arsenic on 37 pages; 2 issues of Ladies' Home Journal; arsenic painted on the paper so heavily that Weber's testing solution turned dark green immediately; a mathematics textbook, a volume of romantic poetry, a cookbook. Each book had been carefully selected from the library's collection, poisoned, and returned to circulation. Each had been checked out by victims, or potential victims who hadn't yet fallen ill. Ashford approached Helena Grayson, who sat very still at her desk, hands folded, eyes distant. "Miss Grayson, I need to ask you some questions. Am I being accused of something, Sergeant?" "Not yet, but books in your library have been deliberately contaminated with poison. 2 people are dead. You have access to all these books. You handle them daily. You would know which patrons prefer which genres." "I would also poison myself," Helena said calmly. "I touch every book that passes through circulation." "Unless you wore gloves, or knew which books to avoid." Helena said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, "I'd like to speak with a lawyer." The search of Helena Grayson's home on Willow Street occurred on April 27th, shortly after dawn. Ashford led the team personally, 4 officers, Dr. Weber, and a photographer to document evidence. The house was remarkably tidy. Downstairs rooms held the expected furnishings: a parlor with aging furniture, a dining room that clearly hadn't been used in years, a kitchen that smelled of old coffee and loneliness. Everything was clean but worn, the dwelling of someone who maintained appearances without caring about comfort. The basement was another matter entirely. They descended narrow wooden stairs into darkness. Someone found the light switch. A single bulb illuminated what Helena Grayson had hidden beneath the respectability of her daily life. The basement had been converted into a laboratory. A workbench ran along one wall, covered with glass beakers, measuring instruments, rubber gloves, brushes of various sizes. Shelves held jars labeled in Helena's precise handwriting: arsenic trioxide, strychnine sulfate, aconite extract, nicotine solution, enough poison to kill hundreds. In one corner stood a bookshelf holding perhaps 20 volumes. Dr. Weber examined them with gloved hands. Every single one was poisoned. Some were duplicates of library books, practice runs, perhaps. Others were different titles, prepared but not yet deployed. They found journals, 3 leather, bound notebooks filled with Helena's meticulous handwriting, dating back to November of 1940. The journals were chilling in their clinical detachment. November 14, 1940, began preparation. Acquired arsenic from Henderson's Hardware under pretense of rat control. The house is old. The story is plausible. First experiments with application methods. Direct powder too obvious. Must find binding agent. November 28, 1940. Glycerin solution successful. Maintains poison in suspension. Dries clear, odorless. Applied to test volume. Pages stick slightly when fresh but become normal after 24 hours. The waiting period is essential. December 10, 1940. Selection criteria established. Patrons who browse extensively but borrow infrequently. Those who linger at specific sections. Must correlate reading habits with moral deficiencies. January 3, 1941. First deployment tomorrow. The mysterious writer prepared with 42 treated pages. Subject, R.H., confirmed adulterer. Witnessed him with Paulson's wife last Tuesday. Wife and children unaware. Justice demands attention. March 7, 1941. R.H., deceased. Result confirmed in newspaper. Timing appropriate. Symptoms developed as predicted. Recovery of book necessary, but natural volumes circulate constantly. No suspicion detected. March 25, 1941. Second deployment. The robe and journals for D.C. Notorious gossip whose tongue has destroyed 3 reputations this year alone. Women like her poison communities more surely than any chemical. There is symmetry in the method. March 29, 1941. D.C. deceased. Method perfected. The journals continued through April, documenting each poisoning with the dispassion of a scientist recording experiments. Helena noted her observations of symptoms, timing of deaths, efficiency of various application methods. She wrote about her victims not as people but as problems solved, moral failures corrected, balances restored. Ashford read the journals in growing horror. This was not madness in any conventional sense. This was calculated, methodical, absolutely controlled. Helena Grayson had transformed her role as librarian, as guardian of knowledge and culture, into the perfect position for dispensing her own twisted justice. They found one more thing in the basement, a list, 20, 3 names, Typerton, alphabetically organized. Beside each name, a brief notation: Becker, James Blasphemer, Caldwell, Dorothy Gossip. Marked through with red ink: Fletcher, Thomas Truant, Henshaw, Robert Adulterer. Marked through with red ink, Morrison, Emmett abortionist, the list went on, nearly a quarter of the town's adult population. Teachers accused of unfair grading, merchants accused of price gouging, miners accused of cowardice in the dark tunnels, women accused of vanity, promiscuity, negligence, men accused of drunkenness, gambling, cruelty. Each person had been judged by Helena Grayson and found wanting. Each person was marked for death. Helena was arrested in her library at 10:30 that morning, handcuffed in full view of the officers, led out through the reading room she'd governed for 23 years. Patrons gathered on the sidewalk, stunned, disbelieving. Miss Grayson, gentle Miss Grayson who helped children find adventure books. Impossible, but evidence is unambiguous. Truth is unforgiving. The trial began on June 2, 1941, in the Somerset County Courthouse. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Charles Brennan, a man whose reputation for thoroughness was legendary. The defense attorney was Martin Kowalski from Pittsburgh, who'd taken the case pro bono because he believed everyone deserved competent representation, even the apparently guilty. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, people standing along the walls, reporters from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia newspapers crowding the press section. This was sensation writ large: the murderous librarian, the poisoned books, the death lurking between innocent pages. Helena Grayson sat at the defense table wearing a dark blue dress, her hair in its customary bun, hands folded. She looked like someone waiting for a library board meeting, not a murder trial. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the poisoned books, the basement laboratory, the damning journals, the victim testimonies. Dr. Weber explained the toxicology findings with scientific precision. Detective Ashford described the investigation's methodical progress. The widow Henshaw wept on the stand, describing her husband's agonizing death. Thomas Fletcher, still recovering, described the sensation of poison burning through his body. The evidence took 3 days to present. Brennan was thorough, relentless, building the case brick by brick until the structure was unassailable. Then the defense called its only witness, Helena Grayson herself. Kowalski had advised against it. Defendants rarely testify. Cross-examination is treacherous. But Helena insisted. She had things to say. She took the stand on June 6th, placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth. When Kowalski asked her to explain herself, Helena Grayson spoke for nearly 2 hours in that soft, cultured voice, never raising her tone, never showing emotion. She described her life: the dutiful daughter who sacrificed her dreams for aging parents, the educated woman trapped in a small town by circumstance and duty, the professional consigned to permanent spinsterhood because available men were crude miners and shopkeepers who found learned women threatening or mockable. "I loved this town," she said. "I dedicated my life to serving this community. The library was my cathedral. Books were my sacrament. I believed in the power of literature to elevate, to educate, to transform. But year after year, I watched this town decay, not just economically, morally. I watched men beat their wives and drink away their wages while children went hungry. I watched women destroy reputations with lies and gossip. I watched teenagers abandon education for immediate gratification. I watched the church preach virtue on Sunday and practice vice the remaining 6 days. And I realized something. Books can educate people who want education, but you cannot force enlightenment on those determined to remain ignorant. You cannot elevate those who prefer to wallow. So I began to think differently about my role. If I couldn't elevate the town, perhaps I could purge it, remove the worst elements, the adulterers, the gossips, the cruel and lazy and blasphemous. Not all at once. That would be chaos, but gradually, carefully, like pruning dead branches so the tree can flourish. The courtroom was silent except for her voice. Each person on my list earned their place. I observed them for months, sometimes years. I documented their offenses. I gave them opportunities to change. They chose not to. Robert Henshaw was destroying his family. Dorothy Caldwell's lies had driven Margaret Spencer to attempt suicide. Oh, that never made the papers, but I knew. Thomas Fletcher was heading toward delinquency. I showed them mercy by acting quickly. The others on my list would have received the same service, had time permitted. Service. She called murder service. The prosecution's cross-examination was devastating. Brennan dismantled her justifications methodically. Who gave her the right to judge? By what authority did she condemn? How was she different from any vigilante murderer? Helena had no answers that satisfied legal or moral standards. She simply maintained that she'd done what was necessary, what nobody else had the courage to do. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder, guilty on 1 count of attempted murder, guilty on 21 counts of reckless endangerment for the poisoned books, not yet claimed by victims. The judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing. Helena Grayson stood, looked directly at the packed courtroom, and said, "I have no regrets. I only regret that I didn't have more time to complete my work. This town needed cleansing. It still does." The judge sentenced her to death by electrocution. Pennsylvania had executed only 3 women in its history. Helena Grayson would be the 4th. The execution was scheduled for October 3, 1941, at State Correctional Institution, Rockview in Center County. Helena spent 5 months in the women's section of the prison, afforded the same privileges as other condemned prisoners. Books from the prison library, correspondence privileges, visits from clergy. She refused all religious counsel. She spent her time reading philosophy, history, poetry. Guards reported she was a model prisoner, polite and cooperative, though utterly emotionless. She never expressed remorse. She never retracted her confession. She maintained that she'd done what was right, and if the law disagreed, the law was deficient. Her attorney filed appeals arguing insanity. How could a sane person methodically poison books? The courts disagreed. Helena Grayson was not insane by any legal definition. She understood right from wrong. She simply disagreed with society's assessment of which was which. The appeals failed. On the morning of October 3rd, at 6 o'clock, Helena Grayson walked to the execution chamber with steady steps. The warden asked if she had final words. Books are more powerful than any government, any church, any law. She said quietly, "They endure when everything else crumbles. What I did will be remembered long after this moment. That's sufficient legacy." At 6:12, 2,000 volts passed through her body. At 6:14, the prison doctor pronounced her dead. She was 47 years old. The Crestwood Public Library remained closed for 6 months. Every single book in the collection, over 7,000 volumes, was examined by state chemists. They found poison in 18 additional books that hadn't yet been identified. The contaminated books were incinerated. The entire building was professionally cleaned. Surfaces tested for residual poison. When the library finally reopened in November of 1941, it had new policies. All books were inspected monthly. Patrons were prohibited from licking fingers to turn pages. Signs posted everywhere reminded readers. Librarians wore gloves when handling returns. The basement was permanently sealed. A new librarian was hired, Mrs. Patricia Reeves, a widow from Philadelphia with impeccable references. She lasted 3 years before requesting transfer. She said the building felt wrong, heavy, sad. Subsequent librarians rarely stayed more than a year or two. The Henshaw and Caldwell families received settlements from the county, though no amount of money could restore lost husbands and mothers. Thomas Fletcher recovered physically but suffered nightmares for years. He enlisted in the military when America entered World War II and died at Normandy on June 7, 1944. His mother always maintained the library had killed him, just delayed by 3 years. The house on Willow Street was sold by the county after Helena's execution. A series of families occupied it over the decades, none staying long. The basement laboratory had been dismantled, but locals claimed the house retained something of its former occupants' darkness. Children avoided walking past it. Real estate agents learned to make excuses. Dr. Morrison, whose name appeared on Helena's death list, moved away in 1940, too. He never publicly stated why, but friends knew he couldn't remain in a town where someone had marked him for death based on false rumors, as it happened. Helena had mistaken his provision of medical care following miscarriages for deliberate abortion. The distinction meant nothing to her rigid morality. Detective Ashford received commendation for his investigation. He remained with the state police for another 15 years, eventually retiring as a captain. In interviews late in his life, he always cited the Grayson case as the most disturbing of his career. Murderers usually have recognizable motives, he said. Greed, passion, revenge. But Miss Grayson believed she was performing a public service. She thought she was helping. That kind of delusion, combined with intelligence and patience, creates something far worse than ordinary evil. It creates systematic destruction cloaked in righteousness. Libraries across America changed their protocols following the Crestwood poisonings. Regular inspection of books became standard. Warnings about page licking appeared in reading rooms. Some institutions began using book carts treated with antimicrobial solutions. The profession of librarianship, once seen as gentle and harmless, was recognized as a position of tremendous trust and potential danger. Because access to knowledge is also access to minds, and someone who controls information can control or destroy those who seek it. The story of Helena Grayson remains a disturbing reminder that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones society never suspects. She wore no mask of evil. She displayed no obvious pathology. She was the helpful librarian, the educated spinster, the quiet neighbor who'd lived in Crestwood her entire life. Her respectability was her camouflage. Her profession was her weapon. But questions remain, as they always do in cases that plumb the depths of human capacity for calculated evil. How many others were on that list who never knew they'd been marked for death? How many borrowed books from her shelves and, by chance or providence, never turned enough poisoned pages to reach lethal dose? The investigation suggested perhaps a dozen more people had been exposed to sublethal amounts. People who'd been ill briefly, recovered, never connected their sickness to the library. They lived their entire lives never knowing how close they'd come to Helena Grayson's judgment. And what of the books themselves? The 18 poisoned volumes that were incinerated, were they truly all of them? The state chemists tested everything they could identify from circulation records, but records were imperfect. Helena had been librarian for 23 years. Who could say with certainty that she hadn't been planning this for longer than her journals indicated? That earlier books, long since returned and recirculated dozens of times, hadn't carried traces of her work. The very randomness of who might pick up a poisoned book created a terror more profound than targeted killing. Anyone could be next. the teenage girl selecting romance novels, the elderly man browsing history, the child reaching for fairy tales. Helena's method democratized murder in the most horrifying way. To this day, the Crestwood Public Library stands on Main Street, though the building's character has changed. The tall windows let in the same light, but it falls on different shelves, different books, different readers. The old Carnegie structure was renovated in the 1970s, the interior gutted and modernized. Some say this was necessary progress. Others whisper it was exorcism. The bronze plaque near the entrance, installed in 1998 on the library's centennial, makes no mention of Helena Grayson or the murders. It speaks only of community service, literary tradition, the importance of knowledge. The town chose forgetting over acknowledgement, as if silence could erase what happened between those walls. But memory persists in other ways. Old-timers still refuse to lick their fingers when turning pages. Parents still warn children never to touch their mouths while reading library books, though they rarely explain why the fear has become instinct divorced from narrative. And on certain quiet afternoons, when the reading room is nearly empty and light slants through those tall windows at particular angles, people report feeling watched, judged, evaluated by unseen eyes that assess worthiness with terrible precision. The house on Willow Street burned down in 2003. Electrical fire, the investigation concluded, though the building had stood for 130 years without incident. The lot remains empty. Nobody has built there. Perhaps nobody wants to. 7 of Helena's journals survive in Pennsylvania State Archives, stored in climate-controlled vaults where historians can access them with permission. They're studied in criminology courses, psychology seminars, library science ethics classes. Students read her methodical planning, her clinical detachment, her absolute conviction, and struggle to comprehend how education and intelligence can be perverted towards such systematic evil. Because that's the lesson Helena Grayson teaches. Intelligence is not wisdom, education is not morality, and the ability to organize knowledge does not confer the right to judge humanity. She believed she was pruning a corrupt tree. In reality, she was the corruption, using her position of trust to commit murder while hiding behind respectability and service. 2 people died because they borrowed books. A third nearly died. Dozens more were endangered. An entire community's sanctuary was violated. Trust itself was poisoned, not just in Crestwood's library, but in libraries everywhere that read about the case and realized how vulnerable their patrons were to anyone with access and intent. If this journey through one of America's most unusual murder cases resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering how ordinary people can justify extraordinary evil, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in history's margins that deserve examination not as entertainment, but as warning, as lesson, as reminder that darkness often wears respectable faces. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere curiosity, and comment sharing your own thoughts. What safeguards exist between civilization and calculated malice? How do we balance trust with vigilance? When does moral certainty become murderous delusion? The answers matter. Because Helena Grayson believed she had them, and 2 people died in a reading room that should have been the safest place in town. Until next time, remember, the most dangerous poison isn't always chemical. Sometimes it's ideological. And sometimes the most terrifying predators are the ones who smile while stamping your due date.